Acts 7 and 8. Well, as a practical matter, the growth of the church happens because of Acts 8:1 and not 1:8. Remember back in 1:8 it said, you will receive power and then you will be witnesses unto me in Jerusalem and Judea. That was the plan. But here's 8:1. At that time a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. So the scattering or the movement of believing Jews, and remember this is still a Jewish movement at this time, happens because of persecution. So let's talk about persecution. It's going to be a theme really of the book of Acts, if not of the entire early, or the life of the early church. This is so foreign to our American democratic freedom of speech, freedom of religion mindset. So it's good to put ourselves back in their world. The first kind, and this is a homegrown list that I have made over the years just watching the book of Acts. Number 1, Jew versus Jew. And let's call this jealousy. This would be an unbelieving Jew persecuting a believing Jew in Jesus out of envy. The word envy is used a couple times, as he sees Jews becoming loyal to Jesus and then having what we would call outstanding effects, or large crowds believing at one point or at a certain moment, and the Jews becoming jealous of that popularity of the movement. Acts 5:14. Believers were increasingly added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women, causing, verse 17, the high priest to rise up filled with jealousy, and then imprisoning Peter and John. 13:45, when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with jealousy, and contradicting and blaspheming, they opposed the things spoken by Paul. Another one, number 2, and let's call this Torah. Remember how unbelieving Jews are going to be living by Torah in their mind, and they're seeing believing Jews dispensing with Torah in their opinion. An unbelieving Jew persecutes a believing Jew for what they consider to be disobeying Torah and thus disobeying Yahweh. 6:11 would be a good example. They induced men to say, we have heard Stephen, this is our story from last time, which carries into the sermon of Stephen today. We have heard Stephen speak blasphemous words against Moses and thus against God. So Jew is opposed to Jew, and Stephen is killed by fellow Jews. Amazing moment. Number 3, again, still Jew versus Jew. And let's call this Gentile inclusion. Because, and we've talked about this is going to be a serious matter of frustration and eventual persecution. We're not there yet in our story, but listen to 21. Well, this is where one Jew persecutes a fellow Jew when a Gentile is allowed to approach Yahweh's sacred space. Again, this is not our world. You have to think like them in order to sense the severity of this moment. This is in 21:28. Paul teaches, they're saying, all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has thus defiled this holy place. Again, our thought is, well, big deal, it's just a building, but listen to what happens. All the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple, and the commander of the garrison was the only one to stop them from beating Paul. So, big issue to them is allowing Gentiles to approach Yahweh's sacred space, or the temple. Now we get into Jew versus Gentile. Persecution. This will be the issue of uncleanness. Again, a major issue in their world, one that we have to get used to understand the New Testament. Here's where a Jew persecutes a Gentile for thinking that he can worship Yahweh without becoming Jewish. In 17:13 at Berea, the city of Berea. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was preached by Paul at Berea, they came there also and stirred up the crowds. 18:13, Paul in Corinth. Paul persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. Paul is asking, as a Jew, Gentiles to believe in Jesus and approach Yahweh as Gentiles. And that is, to a Jew, considered to be, of course, terribly wrong. So those Gentile believers would thus be persecuted by Jews. Number 5. Now we get into Gentile persecution, or pagans against Jews. And this would be very common. A Gentile persecutes a Jew for the worship of Yahweh above that of the Caesar. Of course, the Caesar, the imperial ruler of the empire. This is a quotation from N.T. Wright, Pauline Perspectives. Paul, as a Jew, lived with the settled and unshakable conviction that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob stood over against all other gods and goddesses, claiming unique allegiance. Paul was not opposed to Caesar's empire, but was opposed to Caesar claiming divine status and honors which belonged only to one God. This brought Gentiles to persecute Jews simply for their worship of Yahweh over Caesar. So be watching for that. And then, of course, number 6, this will be happening as Christians begin to multiply later in the book of Acts. Gentile versus Gentile, and this will be simply out of fear for what would happen. And this is, again, so different from what we think of today. Here is where a pagan Gentile would persecute another Christian Gentile for not participating in the city's worship of its ancestral gods. In Philippi, chapter 16, verse 20, in Philippi, the magistrates brought Paul and Silas to the magistrates and said, "These men exceedingly trouble our city, teaching customs which are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or observe." Again, another quotation from N.T. Wright in Paul and the Faithfulness of God, his magnum opus. The religious world of Paul was ordered and tidy to the extent that the great festivals mattered. The proper performance of regular religious festivals, particularly sacrifices, mattered, and the appropriate investigation of omens and auguries mattered. To neglect those was to jeopardize the city and potentially to cast a blight on particular enterprises the city might be conducting. To refuse sacrifice was to refuse the gods. One was endangering the state by either ignoring or insulting any of the divinities involved in civic life. Again, so a Gentile would say to a believer in Jesus, "What are you doing? If you worship Jesus, our city is in peril because the gods will be upset with you for worshiping another deity." So those are the reasons that we'll be seeing persecution happening. Again, chapter 8 is the start of this the severity of persecution as it really grows throughout the book. Well, 3 items in conclusion in our reading. Stephen's speech in chapter 7, a long speech, the entire chapter. What it does is it again reminds us that the framing story of the gospel is the story of Israel. So the entire history of Israel is given there. Their privilege, their fall, their idolatry. And then, of course, it ends with the position of Jesus in the heavens, standing next to Yahweh, fulfilling Daniel 7, 13, and 14. And Stephen is stoned because of it. Here would be the reason that Stephen was stoned. Then the 2 stories that are in chapter 8, I think, are placed side by side by Luke because of how they play out. The sorcerer Simon seems to believe in Jesus or want to believe in Jesus because of the miracles and because of the power and the reputation that he could gain from having the power that Christians had. Peter calls him bound by iniquity in 8:23, so I don't think he was a loyalist at heart. His story is played side by side then by the Ethiopian eunuch, who on the other hand, of course, seems to believe in Jesus for the right reason, as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. Jesus is Lord, of course, but this was in response to his humiliation and obedience to Yahweh. So I think the writer Luke is presenting these 2 stories in chapter 8 back to back to emphasize what the Christian faith stood for again. Not miracles and power, but humility and service.